Just a few housekeeping notes before we start. Please keep your cameras and your mics off while the forum is ongoing. There will be a Q&A session nearer the end, so please feel free to post your questions in the chat at any time for our speakers to address later. Also, this webinar will be recorded and posted online. Today, we are very pleased to have with us Associate Professor Terence Ho, Associate Professor Intan Azura Mokhtar, and Donovan Choy, who will be engaging in discussion on Singapore's 2022 budget. Terence has had 18 years of experience in the civil service, holding policy, research, and leadership positions in MTI, MOM, MOF, and MOE. He is currently Associate Professor in Practice at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Intan is a former Member of Parliament and member of the Government Parliamentary Committees for Manpower and for Transport. She is currently Associate Professor at the Singapore Institute of Technology, advisor to the Education Services Union, and member of the Board of Trustees of NTUC UCare Fund, among other positions. Donovan is an independent researcher based in Singapore. He is an alumnus of the Institute for Humane Studies and a young affiliate at the European-based Network for Constitutional Economics and Social Philosophy. He was previously a visiting scholar at the American Institute for Economic Research. Now, without further ado, let me hand the time over to our speakers to further introduce themselves and kick off the discussion on the 2022 budget.
Okay, thank you so much to Zuan for the introduction, and I'm really glad to be here. And thank you all for coming. Very warm welcome and good evening to all. I look forward to the discussion with fellow members of the panel as well as with participants today. So a bit about myself. During my 18 years in the Singapore Public Service, one of the highlights was the time I spent in the Ministry of Finance as a director working on the budget for 6 years between 2011 and 2016. It was during this period of time that I saw many changes that were made to our social and economic policies, ranging from tax changes to greater redistribution and risk pooling, as well as strong investment in early childhood education and lifelong learning. These changes were motivated by structural changes in Singapore's economy and society, including slowing economic growth, the aging population, the global competition that Singapore faces as a global city as well, leading to upward pressure on inequality and social stratification. So why I wrote this book published by World Scientific called Refreshing the Singapore System is really to extend and update the Singapore story that many are familiar with, Singapore story of development, to extend it into the 21st century and relate how the Singapore system, as it were, has adapted to fresh challenges. So besides capturing as comprehensively as possible the policy moves over the past 15, 20 years, I also endeavored to take an integrative or systems approach to analyzing socioeconomic issues and policy solutions, and to discuss a range of policy options and engage with some ideas beyond the current framework. So turning to Budget 22, I thought I'd take the opportunity to recap some of the main features and the main initiatives in this budget. Of course, like all budgets, it builds on the previous budgets and should not be seen in isolation. The two main themes in this budget really to position Singapore for future challenges and opportunities, and secondly, to strengthen the social compact. In terms of immediate support, there was a $500 million set aside for jobs and business support package, and another $560 million for a household support package. And then, of course, much anticipated were the changes to the fiscal system. The implementation details of the GST increase were given, as well as an update on the size of the assurance package for transitional support, as well as enhancement of the permanent GST voucher scheme. Property taxes were made more progressive, and there was taxes on luxury cars as well were raised. And of course, the top marginal personal income tax was also raised. And quite notably too, the carbon tax, there was a schedule of increases that were set out from the current $5 per ton of greenhouse gas emissions to a range of $50 to $80 per ton by 2030. As with most budgets, there were measures to build capabilities and skills among firms and workers, to accelerate the growth of high potential Singapore companies, as well as help the broad base of SMEs in key areas like the internationalization, digitalization, innovation, and capability building, training for workers, and the scaling up of the NTUC's company training committees. There was also the Skills Future Career Transition Program, a train and place program for workers to help them reskill for new jobs and careers. And of course, in the education sphere, there were many announcements, and most parents and students, which many of them would cheer the doing away with mid-year examinations at all levels, and more educational pathways as well for the young. For most businesses and many workers as well, the manpower, and in particular foreign manpower or work pass measures, were significant. These include the increase in the employment pass minimum salary, as well as the introduction of a new points system for EPs called the Complementarity Assessment Framework, or COMPASS. There were changes to the S-Pass minimum salary and Tier 1 levies for the mid-skilled workers, and there were tighter dependency ratio ceilings or quotas in construction and process sectors. So these are some of the main features of Budget 22, and they add to the many measures taken to boost fiscal revenues over the years and to strengthen social support. So the big picture over several budgets has been an overall shift towards greater social support and redistribution to deal with the many structural challenges that Singapore faces. And I think this budget also has forced the pace of transformation needed by businesses, ranging from sustainability to paying local workers more through progressive wages to the foreign manpower reliance. But at the same time, there was ample support as well for firms to make the change. There was a progressive wage credit scheme to co-share the costs of introducing progressive wages. And businesses, of course, can tap on the Enterprise Sustainability Program to capture opportunities in the green economy. And there are various financing support and grants for internationalization, innovation, both for the broad base of SMEs as well as the Singapore global enterprises. So I think I will stop here and hand over to, is it Intan or to go next?
Thank you very much, Terence. I think Terence has done a wonderful job in summarizing the main aspects and features of Budget 2022, so I will not go there. I won't even attempt to go there. Just to share a little bit about my background and also to look in why I came up together with Prof Yaacob, the book that was recently published by World Scientific. For about 9 years, I was involved in providing inputs that went into coming up with the annual budget, having had the privilege and opportunity to be an MP, be part of the Singapore Parliament. And I was also involved in quite a number of pre-budget meetings, and that was how I first got to know Terence, because I was on GPC Manpower and Terence was in MOM at that time. So Terence is very, very helpful, very brilliant in providing us with what are some of the areas that we needed to focus for that particular year's budget. So I'm very glad to be able to share this panel today with Terence. For me, coming up with the book, let's go into the book first, is really for a very pragmatic reason. I'm teaching social context and change management in SIT. And what I really needed was to have a collection of readings and case studies that would really look at our own local context, look at our specific challenges and issues that we face in Singapore, so that students can refer to these materials as part of their readings in preparation for the case studies and discussions that we have in class. When I first joined SIT, the materials that we had were largely based on sociology textbooks when it came to social issues and social challenges. And I felt that these were too broad and too Western-centric. So I wanted a collection of case studies and views and perspectives that are really local. Hence the intent and the decision to go on and come up with this book. Coming on to Budget 2022, based on my past experience, I think like what Terence mentioned earlier, each year's budget is really a culmination and a build-up from previous year's budgets. And I think this year, even though it's a build-up, there were some features of the budget, some provisions made that were quite different and quite new. One case in point is the income tax rate. The last time that we had the personal income tax rate that was revised, I think that was how many years back? I think, if I'm not wrong, 30 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. So this year, in this year's budget, the income tax rate has increased. Okay? And I think that's good, because I think it's a way to also provide a lot more revenue for the government from higher income earners. Okay? So the last increase to 22% of income tax rate was in budget 2015. Then that was effective from the year of assessment 2017. But before that, I think the initial change to 22% was about 30 years back. So there are some features that we know that the government is really listening to sentiments on the ground, and some of the feedback, especially for middle income earners, have been giving to the government. What are some of the current challenges and issues that they face in trying to mitigate cost of living, but at the same time, trying to live up and achieve the aspirations that they have as their families grow and as our country progresses. So I think I'll stop here and invite Donovan to give his take and share a little bit more about his work and what he does. Over to you, Donovan.
Thank you, Intan. It's hard to follow up on the introduction of the other two panelists who are far more well achieved and whose work is far more well esteemed, I think, in academic and policy making circles, but I'll try. First of all, I'm very honored to be on this panel with Terence and Intan. For myself, I do not come from a public policy making background, but I have been following closely a lot of these issues and been writing on them over the years, less so from an academic perspective. And I think the book that I published with my co-author on World Scientific, the name of the book is Liberalism Unveiled. The book is really a culmination of many of these writings and observations that I've made over the years. And mainly what we look at, so there's maybe like 9 chapters in the book, and in each chapter of the book, we look at a certain policy area through a classical liberal lens. And my co-author and I believe that the book is largely a break away from the consensus, the constrictions between the debate in Singapore. Very typically, when you look at politics in Singapore, it's framed between a pro-government versus an anti-government lens. And what my co-author Brian and I try to do is to sort of break that lens and try to suss out what the goods are of each side and what the bads are of each side, and try to sort of bring a synthesis. And we do genuinely believe it is a fresh approach. It is a consistent theoretical lens that we are looking at through Singapore issues. Just maybe to give one example, so I think in one of the chapters of the book, we look at meritocracy, which, if you are familiar with Singapore politics, is one of the most evergreen topics in Singapore. And meritocracy is a huge deal in Singapore because the government has historically for decades prided itself on hiring people into the public sector through a meritocratic work basis. And very typically, I think critiques of
we would like to encourage our participants, our audience, if you have any questions or any thoughts, not even questions, but thoughts, your perspective, please do share with us and we can build up on it, we can discuss it. I think when it comes to our social issues, nothing beats having those engaged conversations. We will not necessarily come to a solution or a decision or an agreement entirely, but at least we can share our different perspectives and viewpoints.
Perhaps while we are waiting for our audience to warm up, maybe we can just hear some of your insights from the 3 panelists, because I'm sure all of you come from different backgrounds. And so maybe even though there are similar points of the budget that we are all focusing on, there may also be different viewpoints among the 3 of you. So I think it'll be very interesting for us as an audience to hear your perspectives on the various points that you all have raised. I think Donovan's internet is slightly problematic, but maybe Prof Intan and Prof Terence, you all can go ahead first. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I could share something about the manpower measures. Yeah, some people have wondered whether Singapore is, in a way, turning insular or maybe not as welcoming to foreigners as before. But my own reflection is that Singapore has to remain really an open, global city, given the size of our sort of domestic economy and the fact that we are heavily dependent on trade, cross-border investments, and so on. So this is really, if you like, the lifeblood of Singapore. But at the same time, we do need to manage the overall numbers of foreigners at all skill levels in Singapore. So in an earlier period, from about 2010 onwards, there were yearly tightening of raising of levies, tightening of the dependency ratio ceilings, and raising of the minimum incomes. They were needed to keep the growth of the foreign workforce sustainable. So at the same time, I think in 2022, this year's budget, it sort of adds and builds on the measures last taken in 2020 as well. And what it amounts to is quite a significant tightening also of the, especially at the EP and SPAS level. But this is really necessary. And we need to make sure we make the most use of the foreign workforce that we have here by increasing complementarity, and hence also the introduction of the compass system. So that's just my reflection on the foreign manpower policies.
Thank you, Terence, for sharing that. Also to build on what Sharon has shared related to the manpower policies is the support for mid-career workers. But before I delve into that, probably just to pick on one of the radical ideas that was shared or bounced off during one of the Committee of Supply debates, and one of my former parliamentary colleagues suggested that university degrees, have like a use-by date or expiration date in the first 5 years and so on. I think that took a lot of people by surprise, and some almost, I think, fell out of their chairs when they heard that. But I think the intent is good. Maybe the way it's communicated could have been improved further. I think the intent really is that while we do not trivialize the value of a university degree, I think the recognition is that in our industries are changing very quickly. The way that we train our university graduates sometimes can't keep up with the changes that are happening, the dynamic changes that are happening in the industries. When you go through a 3-year degree or 4-year degree program, by the time you graduate, I think probably about half of what you've learned over the past 4 years may be somewhat not so relevant by the time you join your full-time career or the industries. So I think that's the message really that my former parliamentary colleague wanted to convey was that we need to continue to upskill, reskill, dip skill, whatever skill that you call it, as Patrick Tay used to say, cross-skill even. So we need to continue with all these causes to ensure that our skills and our knowledge base sets remain relevant. And it does not mean that there's no value to the university degree, because the training, the internship, what you learn, it's still there, the value is still there. But I think there's a need to emphasize that we have to continue to upskill. So I'm very glad that in Budget 2022, there's greater support, especially for mid-career workers, because we have to recognize that the degree that we probably obtained 10, 20 years back, you need to refresh it with new skills, new certifications, and so on. So the support for the SG United Mid-Career Pathway Program, the company attachment is now made permanent. It's no longer on a trial basis. It's made permanent with full-time attachment with training allowances. And the Skills Future Career Transition Program is introduced that will provide industry-oriented training courses for job seekers. And I think that's important, making sure that you get a foot in, have some exposure in the industry that you intend to join, so that you can learn on the job while accumulating or getting the training and the knowledge and skills required. Yeah. So that's what we're also trying to do in SIT. If you look at the slew and offerings of degree programs that we have in SIT, it's really quite messy, to say the least, compared to more traditional universities, more comprehensive universities like NUS and NTU. In one class that I teach, I can have students from 2 or 3 slightly different pathways and programs, because and some of them are mature workers. They are mid-career entrants, maybe in their 30s, in their 40s, but they come back with the support of employers to get their university degree now. but during the day they work, at night and then they will attend classes with us. And sometimes we do it in a hybrid format where the class is there physically, the PET, the pre-employment training students or the undergraduates as they call them are there, but for them they are the CET, continuing education training students. They are at the workplace and then they join us over Zoom and so on. So we try to accommodate because I think that's important to ensure that both our PET and CET students have opportunities for industry exposure, as well as to go back to the university to improve and upgrade their skills. Okay. There's a question for Donovan, is it?
Yeah, no, there is a question for me, but I'll take it later because it's going to divert us quite largely from the budget discussion. I guess maybe one point that I wanted to ask before my internet cut off earlier was on the point on the GST tax, right? And that's really what's most on everyone's minds. So I think when I look at the GST discussion in the media, right, the government is trying to tell everyone like this is why we need it because we don't want to go into deficit given our spending. And the people who are most angsty and unhappy about it, they see it as sort of like just another cash grab by the government. And intuitively, it's very hard to intuitively, right? There's something wrong here because if the GST is such a politically unpopular tax, then why would the government impose it unless they really, really needed to? So I feel like that's a sign that there's very good economic reasons for why the government wants to levy a broad-based tax. What are your thoughts on this, both Intan and Terence? I guess maybe just like on the differences between a broad-based tax like the GST as opposed to a tax that targets, like the top 1%, a wealth tax.
Go ahead, Terence.
Yeah, I was going to ask you whether you wanted to go ahead first. Yeah, I think there's no doubt that expenditures are rising, particularly as the population ages. So the government then needs to find the sort of various sources of revenues. And there's a little bit of, if you like, rotational play among the various sources. We try to be quite broad-based to make the tax system resilient. So we have, of course, the income tax, the personal income tax, the corporate taxes, we have wealth taxes, and we're very fortunate in Singapore to derive a significant chunk of the annual budget from the investment returns on the past reserves. But as what Donovan pointed out, many countries find that a value-added tax like GST is very useful because it's broad-based, it's more difficult to evade. And particularly in Singapore, where we want to try to keep the income taxes low on the broad middle, it becomes very difficult to raise a significant revenue just by taxing on the high end. So therefore, the GST becomes then a very important source. It's also perhaps less strongly correlated to economic cycles compared with, say, corporate income tax or personal income tax. So there's a bit of a stabilizer there. So I think it's a critical part of the entire portfolio of revenue streams. The only issue, of course, with the GST is that it is regressive. That is, the lower income, in terms of the GST expenses as a proportion of the income, they would find it's higher. And hence, the government has needed to put in place enough offsets through the permanent GST voucher, as well as the transitional support for this increase, the assurance package, to offset the costs for the lower to middle income households significantly, and particularly retiree households.
Just to add on to what Terence shared, for every year's budget, this for the last 5 years, if I recall correctly, government social spending has actually increased, both for education as well as healthcare. Like what Terence pointed out, because of our aging population, by the year 2030, we'll be a super aged society, not even an aging society, because more than 20% of our population would be above 65 years old. That means that there's a lot more spending that's required in the healthcare sector. Even though our birth rate total fertility rate is falling, but we still need to allocate a lot more to education because aspirations are also increasing. As our country, as our nation becomes more mature, aspirations would also increase. So there's a lot more spending that has to be apportioned to finance and subsidize education in the IHLs, for instance. Yeah, that's where most of us would probably want our children to have the education level up to. Coming back to the point that Donovan raised about what about looking at other forms of tax revenues, for example, wealth tax or capital gains tax. I think, yes, we do not have both capital gains tax or wealth tax in Singapore. Some countries do, but it's not easy to always implement it and ensure that there's parity, it's fair. One example, especially for the broad middle portion of Singaporeans, one example is, let's say when we purchase a HDB flat and over time sell it, there's some capital appreciation, then do you tax that? Do you have to pay additional tax on the capital appreciation? But for a lot of Singaporeans, that probably forms part of their nest egg, or the money that they wish to apportion to the children's education, or to take short holidays to improve social well-being for the family. So it's not so easy to implement. It's probably easy to say and suggest, but these are the considerations that the government has when it comes to imposing those other forms of tax revenues like wealth tax and capital gains tax.
Yeah, thanks both. I think broadly speaking, right, when we look at like tax discussions, there's always something that I observe personally is that people are always complaining when the government raises taxes, but you don't hear the same amount of resistance when the government proposes to spend, like a huge chunk somewhere else, right? And that sort of asymmetry, I think, in voter sentiment, right, is equivalent to if you were, let's say you were drawing $5,000 a month, and then more than 5,000 of it is going to be spent elsewhere, and you're not worried about how you're going to pay down that debt. And I think that sort of like that fiscal discipline, right, it is not reflected in when many people are complaining about the GST. I'm largely sympathetic to some of the I guess the explanations, right, that broad-based taxes are obviously not equal. They are hit the low income especially more, and that's why the government has this whole slew of rebates and USAVE vouchers to sort of equalize it, right? But I think what people need to really remember is that the reason why these taxes are imposed are so that the government can balance out their budget and not go into debt. So if you look at, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, right? I believe that it's only been since 2020 where our expenditure is exceeding our revenue, and that was because of COVID. Before 2020, the Singapore government has an exceptional record at balancing their budget, which is an anomaly for most developed countries, right? Most developed countries do not have the same fiscal discipline as Singapore. And that's precisely why we were able to spend that much more right now when the pandemic hit, because we were balancing our budget for the past 20 to 30 years. So that's one point on the tax proposal. And as to, I guess, the way to think about like broad-based taxes and taxes that wealth taxes that hit the top 1 to 10%, right? I think there was an analogy that my teacher used long ago when I was in uni, and I thought it was very useful in sort of like helping me think of like the impact of these types of two different taxes. And the analogy he used was, let's imagine that if everybody whose surname started with T right now was taxed 20% more in Singapore. Let's assume that tax was actually passed in Parliament. What's going to happen is that everyone whose last name is Tan or Teng, right, is going to change their behavior drastically. And that kind of discriminatory taxes, right, that force change of behavior for just a very narrow group of people, is bad for the economy, because you are going to what economists call disequilibrate the economy, right? You're going to change it all out of whack. There are processes in place, this is how people do business, and if you just impose a tax that hits a very small, narrow group of people, you're going to change a lot of that, and that's bad generally for the economy. And I think that's how economists think of a generally bad way to raise taxes, as opposed to a broad-based tax, which is levied equally across the board. since everybody is going to get taxed equally, on the margin, that does not change economic behavior that much. And that's why I think one of the main reasons why the PAP favors a broad-based tax, as politically unpopular as it is to raise taxes. And that's maybe just one theoretical point that I wanted to touch on. Are there any other points that we want to talk about in the budget? I guess maybe we were talking a little bit about the immigration areas, right? And I think that's one of the big changes as well this year, because, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't ever recall the government moving towards a points-based immigration system, which is what the new compass system is trying to do, right? Instead of filtering migrant workers and white-collar workers through a tax levy, they're going to try and do it through a points-based system now. What are your, broadly speaking, what are your thoughts on that? Terence, earlier you mentioned that if manpower is a lifeblood of the Singaporean economy. I was wondering if maybe you could elaborate on how like that might fit into the new immigration system.
Yeah, thanks, Donovan. Maybe I could just sort of add on to the earlier point that you mentioned as well, that really in the past decades, at least before the 2000s, the government was actually accumulating consistently large budget surpluses. So if you like, that's why we managed to build up the past reserves from which a lot of the current budgets are deriving from the investment income. And if you like, one way of thinking about it is like almost a life cycle sort of consumption pattern when the nation is young. And of course, as we were developing and incomes were rising rapidly, and there were not so many seniors in a sense to support, so the healthcare and other expenditure was also less. That's when the government accumulated quite a bit of surpluses. And I think in the more recent decades, it's closer to a balanced budget, at least over the term of government, because our social needs are growing tremendously, particularly in healthcare. I also wanted to respond to a couple of the questions that were brought up in the chat on how, who decides what goes into the budget and who makes the final call as to what goes into the budget. So I suppose the government, through various channels, is aware of many of the structural challenges that we face in Singapore, whether social challenges, environment, or economic challenges. And it's very important for government officials to also keep the ear close to the ground to find out what the concerns are from various sources. So indeed, there will be much feedback, whether it's from the business community, trade associations, but also the people sector, through the grassroots, NGOs, voluntary VWOs, which are now called the social service agencies, and citizens also are able to directly pitch ideas to the government for the budget. So all of this, of course, gets digested. And you see that many measures these days in the budget, they may take a while to to be cooked. And sometimes you see an announcement, maybe at the National Day rally, that something's going to be introduced, but the details come a bit later. And that's a good thing too, to show directionally where things may be going, and also allow for more feedback to sort of cook the measures properly before they are finally rolled out. I think in the past, maybe more often than not, the government may fully cook something before revealing it, but that also comes with a few risks. So I think there are pros and cons, but I think it's good that some of these things take a bit longer to sort of be cooked. I think, Donovan, you also asked about asked for some views on the points-based system and the work pass system. How does that sit with us being an open economy? I think the government has tried to keep the messaging quite clear that Singapore definitely remains open to talent at all levels, particularly those that can complement Singaporeans as well. So in a way, there's still no absolute quota or cap on the number of employment pass holders, which are the highest skill level among the three types of work passes. And actually the main system for EP is still based on salary, and the point system is more of an overlay, so that besides meeting the minimum salary requirement for a firm to bring employment pass holder, they also have to meet, they also have to pass this compass framework. And it provides, to some extent, two advantages in my view. One of them is that the minimum salary sometimes can be a bit blunt, doesn't take into consideration whether certain skills are not or quite adequately present in Singapore and short supply and so on and so forth. And also it provides a degree of transparency so that firms also know when they are being, in a sense, prior to this, we had this fair consideration framework watch list, where firms that didn't have very good employment hiring practices that were perhaps discriminatory against Singaporeans would be put on a watch list and at risk of having their work pass privileges suspended or curtailed. So the point, this new compass system gives a bit of transparency, so firms know what they need to do to be able to get in the foreign manpower they need. I think I'll stop here. I'm sure Intan would be able to add on.
Thank you, Terence. So that was Terence addressing the 2 points, 2 questions raised by Charlotte and Rachel, I think, in the chat on who decides on how the budget is created. Just to add on to what Terence had shared earlier, it's not just the Minister for Finance or the Ministry of Finance that decides, okay, this is the budget for this year. There's a lot of ground up feedback and inputs. If you don't already know or notice, for example, one platform is Reach Singapore, which is reaching out for reaching everyone for active citizenry at home. That's one platform that the government has to reach out to individuals, even on certain issues or certain concerns that we may have that will probably have a role to play in deciding the budget for the following year. And of course, for the budget, it's an overall sum that the government is going to spend or will apportion for the next year of government. But of course, within the government itself, there are many different heads or different ministries, and each ministry or each head will decide, okay, how are we going to spend and allocate funds for specific initiatives or policies or programs that we're going to implement within that under that ministry. So there are a lot of inputs to it, like what Terence mentioned, from individuals, from the trade unions, from the SSAs, and so on. Yeah. There was a question here by Victor about GST plus direct transfers and high social spending should make most citizens better off, but it doesn't feel that way psychologically, especially when individuals encounter higher GST. Is this inevitable? In my opinion, Victor, I think it's quite inevitable. Whenever GST is increased, people won't say, yay, GST is increasing. People won't feel happy about it. Because why? It's a broad-based consumption tax. It affects each and every one of us. The more you consume, the more you have to pay in terms of GST. And like what Terence pointed out earlier, it is regressive, so it affects lower income Singaporeans a lot more, because we feel as though for the amount that you're earning every month, you feel that you're paying much more in GST, right? But that's where the transfers, the offsets, the vouchers, the GST vouchers are supposed to minimize or help to alleviate some of the pain points that you feel when you have to pay more out of pocket for your GST payments. Yeah? So it's not easy because it affects each and every one of us. It's a broad-based consumption tax, right? It's quite inevitable that it affects us psychologically, when you know that you have to pay more for something that you purchase or service that you make use of. So can we address this gut response in an effective way? I think even in many countries, VAT, value-added taxes, are quite high. People are not always happy to pay for it, but I'm really not sure whether we can address it in an effective way. I think one way that our government tries to address that is through a lot more transfers and offsets and vouchers, especially to help lower income Singaporeans.
Yeah, no, I think Victor makes a good point, right? And really his question is really like wading into the areas of like behavioral economics, right? So behavioral economists, they like to talk about how making multiple payments is psychologically more discomforting to a person, and we prefer to make a lump sum payment, even though the numbers don't really, the numbers of the smaller payments over many periods of, over a longer period may become a smaller, add up to smaller than the lump sum, right? It is a good point, but really I think it's very hard to, it's very hard to explain to someone who is living on a much smaller salary that the amount that they're paying, right, in GST taxes is better off than if they didn't have tax at all, right? I think maybe one of the drawbacks of a wealth tax is that, and what the Singapore government has traditionally been very resistant to, is a lot of people have this imagination that if you just raise like a huge chunk from the wealthy, right, and then you will leave sort of the middle income and the lower income unscathed. It's nice in theory, but in practice, the wealthy are also the ones with the tools at their disposal to escape these taxes. And as a result of that, what you're going to see over time is that if the government were to try to impose wealth taxes, is that the rich will leave with their capital, and then when Singapore has less capital, the borrowing interest rates, right, are higher. And when the interest rates are higher, the businesses will slow down. Less people will start new businesses, and that sort of like impact will start to trickle down, but you won't see it in the short term. You will maybe see it like 3 years down the road or 5 years down the road. And the voter 5 years down the road is not going to think back, oh, 5 years ago, I didn't have to pay an increase in Gst taxes, right? So you see, it's very, I guess really my point is that the trying to balance out that act of like raising a broad-based tax with the political sentiment, it is a very challenging issue, and definitely the government will not want to impose a tax that gets a lot of people angry if they didn't want to, but I do think they have quite good reasons for it.
Maybe if I could also add on to, in response to Victor's very good question, in terms of some of the transfers or social support that the government gives, I think for a few of the measures, they've tried to make it a bit more frequent rather than maybe once or twice a year, to make it quarterly or more frequent. And they also have ways to remind people this is the amount that you have received, using a bit of the behavioral economics sort of thinking. But I think this is quite a big challenge that is hard to address. There's no real silver bullet, because also things like the GST would then be also conflated with other drivers of cost increase. Right? Like right now, we are seeing inflation across a range of items, energy prices going up. And there's also something that is not quite even captured in when we say that real incomes are rising at the median, at the 20th percentile, but there's also this lifestyle inflation that the social norms of how people are consuming things are actually, the types of bubble tea or drinks that we consume are a bit different from the past. So even inflation will not be able to fully, measures of inflation will not be able to pick this up fully. Besides transfers, I think we also need to look at low-cost options in Singapore to make sure that there are sufficient options, whether in transport and food, that are affordable for most Singaporeans, even the low-income households, so that they will feel that they're not being excluded from society or from the mainstream. I think this is an area deserving of a lot of policy consideration.
I think that's a very good point that Terence brought up. The options that are available to make sure that there's always affordability, even for the lowest income Singaporeans. One good example would be like house brands in our fair price supermarkets. Right? Those are significantly more affordable compared to other brands, for instance. And the fact that we have our hawker centers that provide quality food at affordable prices. Right?
I guess maybe one question I wanted to ask the both of you is, we're moving more towards like broader macro issues right now. So obviously, the crafting of the budget and raising of taxes is an incredibly complex issue, right? It requires that policymakers be able to foresee into the future, like 1, 2, 3, 4 years, how our raising of taxes will affect the budgets that we raise down the line, in line with how the global climate is changing. And I think really the best example of this is that the government had a perfect plan for how they wanted to reduce their carbon footprint over time. And that has obviously been thrown out of the window because of the Ukraine-Russia war. And Russia is one of the biggest suppliers of energy in the world. But since now they are sanctioned from the rest of the world, that means that we don't have rich countries like Singapore, we may not have the luxury to slowly walk down that path of gradual carbon taxes and slowly move ourselves to cleaner energies, right? So I guess maybe my question is this, from a policymaker's perspective, right? You've already created your budget in 6 months ago, and then 1 year later, the global climate changes. What are like sort of the challenges, when it pertains to in the issue like the energy crisis right now? How do you cope with that?
Would Intan like to go first, or shall I have a crack at it first?
Go ahead, Terence.
Yeah, I think there are some priorities that are a given. So, for example, the need to transition to a more sustainable economy is going to be a core part of our strategy in Singapore. So that is a fixed point and does not change. But Donovan is absolutely right that there are all these curveballs that are thrown at us from time to time by events that are not foreseen. And therefore, our plans need to build in that flexibility and nimbleness while keeping an eye on the end goal. So, for instance, with inflation, high energy prices, we then need to sort of enhance some of the support in terms of utilities, in terms of other support for firms and households to get through this period. And even the endpoint for the carbon tax is expressed as a range. So there's some flexibility there to determine what is the endpoint as well. So I think all these will need to be factored in. Unfortunately, I think we have the resources to be able to help with transitional support and to be able to stagger maybe some of the original plans if necessary.
And really, the point is that it's so hard for when voters think of policy issues, they tend to think of it in a single issue, right? And the job of the policymaker is trying to balance this great trade-off between so many different objectives. But if you were only an environmentalist and you were only looking at, for instance, the CO2 emissions, right, you will probably be quite unhappy. But you're not looking at the people in the lower income levels who might be hurt by the carbon taxes who are levied, and which we can't continue right now because of the inflationary crisis, right? Any thoughts on this, Dr. Intan?
Yeah, Donovan, you're absolutely right. When it comes to introducing measures, new policies, the government has to take a whole of nation approach, looking at all the different perspectives, the different segments that are affected. But for most of us, it's always an emotive issue. What affects me the most? What affects my pockets the most? And it's understandable. We are only human beings. We only earn a certain amount of money each month, and we have to pay a lot more from that, depending on the different policies and interventions that are introduced. So the government has to sometimes make very difficult decisions and implement policies that may not be easy, may not please everyone. But I think what's equally important is not just the policies and changes that are implemented, but also the communication, the engagement in explaining to Singaporeans why we have to do this, and why we have to do this now, why can't we do this later, or why we have to do that later, so that there's a greater understanding. I think having those continuous engaged conversations is important, because each one of us has our own priorities, has our own perspectives on things, but we need to come together to have that conversation so that we understand what some of the constraints are, what are some of the trade-offs the government would have to consider. Okay? So I think the government has improved its communication over time. There's still definitely some way to go, but if I look at year to year, from the part that I was still in Parliament until now, I think the communication has improved significantly. Explaining to Singaporeans why we are doing certain things and why we are not doing certain things and so on.
On the point about communication, I've always been a little bit puzzled by this. Is the consensus that the Singapore government does not communicate their policies very effectively? Because whenever, for me, I look at Straits Times, right, and they have always these cute infographics, and generally it's always been quite easy for me to understand. But clearly, I'm in the minority. Am I wrong?
Well, Donovan, I think in this day and age, people want information that's literally in the palm of their hands. So what doesn't appear in your mobile phone is not quite information that you would read. Whether or not you're a digital native or a digital immigrant, I think people want information that's bite-sized, easy to digest, and literally in the palm of your hand. So people tend to believe information that's shared from within their own social networks, whether it's through WhatsApp and so on. And not everyone always reads mainstream media. People prefer attention-grabbing headlines. So it's the government also has to find ways in which it can have and I wouldn't say dominate, but at least take that space on the social media platforms to make sure that the messaging is right, the messaging is clear enough and it can reach out to as many Singaporeans across the different demographics as much as possible.
Maybe to add to that also, I think we need a range of different types of collateral to reach out to different segments of the population. So some things that could go viral maybe by social media, videos and other, simple infographics. But also sometimes the government has used, let's say, people to people. So the Silver Ambassadors, for example, to visit some of the homes of the seniors to explain to them the rather complex benefits that could be given through healthcare. I also wanted to quickly pick up on a question that came through the chat on whether inflation rates affect the budget. I think this was linked to our earlier conversation that government needs to be nimble, and maybe some of the utility support, for example, or other forms of support, including the lower cost options that Dr. Intan also mentioned, house brand food. There are various ways to address that. Another key way to address inflation that's not quite through the budget is actually through monetary policy, and that would be quite key to managing inflation.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I'm actually about to going to start wrapping up the discussion, but I wanted to go back earlier to a question that was asked very early on by Reza. Apologize for coming to your question last because it's not super pertaining to the budget. And while I'm answering the question, I guess if anyone else has any questions relating to the budget, please feel free to throw it in the chat right now because we are probably going to close in 10 minutes or so. So Reza's question was, so it's a question regarding meritocracy, right? How can we get greater representation of minority races without sacrificing the meritocratic system? And the minority races are underrepresented in many fields, strangely enough, but in our parliament. So first of all, right, I think that at the very root of the meritocracy issue is a definitional misunderstanding. Most people do not even get right the definition of what meritocracy really is. We sort of equate it with fairness, but it's not really fairness if you speak to a philosophy major. What a philosophy major would tell you is that meritocracy is a philosophy that says the people whom should lead are the ones whom are most capable. They do not care about your race. They do not care about your background. They do not care about anything but your ability to lead. And Lee Kuan Yew himself was a huge proponent of the meritocratic philosophy, right? There was a very contentious quote that he made when many years ago. He said something to the effect of, if a jumbo jet of 300 Singapore's policymakers were to crash, Singapore would die immediately because that 300 people represented the most capable people in Singapore that was steering the country. So to answer your question about underrepresentation of race, right? You see, meritocracy does not even try to filter for race. If the best people in the country were all Malay or Indian, then meritocracy would say that yes, they should be in positions of power. If they were all Chinese, if they were all white, then they should be, right? Race is not even a factor within the meritocratic philosophy. It's about who can lead and who is most capable of doing so. So I think that really was the right answer to that question.
If I can jump in, Donovan, I
Sure.
think what we also would need is not just a meritocratic system, but something to complement the meritocratic system is the diversity and inclusion. Understanding that Singapore is a multiracial, multi-religious, pluralistic society. While we can have the best minds, the best people with the best qualities to lead, we also need to have representation of the diverse views. Even groups that are traditionally seen to be marginalized, because it is only through representation of the different segments of our society that we have a better understanding of challenges, issues, concerns, and perspectives. And that can only help us make better informed decisions on the strategies that we need for our nation, the strategies for our future. So we need to, so it's not just like what you correctly mentioned, it's not just about meritocracy alone. It's not just about having the best, but also having meritocracy as well as diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. And really, I think the point that my co-author and I tried to make in our book was that the problem is not the meritocratic system as it is today. The problem is with the understanding of what meritocracy is, right? The government can purport itself to run itself on meritocracy, but at any given one time, people think of what merit is subjectively, right? And some people may think of it in ability, some people may think of it in other values. But given that the government cannot pursue this many different paths all at the same time, they have to settle on certain areas which they believe to be meritorious. And I think for the Singapore's case, traditionally it has been academic merit or business expertise, right? And that's why people who maybe don't really do that well in their formative years in primary and secondary schooling, they do tend to find that maybe it's a little bit harder to catch up later on in life. And so to answer your question, Renza, if you're even still there actually, to answer your question, I 100% agree that like racial underrepresentation is important, but the problem is not so much meritocracy, the system in place itself, but meritocracy as a guiding philosophy. There are other values and other tenets that come into play in trying to lead a country, and absolutely fairness and racial equality is one of them.
And I think to also add on to that, in the first 50 years of our nation building, we really needed leaders who were, I would say, scholars who were really doing well academically. But as our nation and society matures and progresses, I think we need to have a representation of different types of abilities, not just academic abilities and excellence in their studies or academic results. We need people who who excel in interpersonal relations, for example, who excel in understanding social issues, or excel in understanding what are some of our concerns in sustainable development or the aesthetics, the arts, sports, and so on. Because it is only through that representation that we can make the best collective decisions for our future as a pluralistic, multi-racial, multi-religious society. So I'm glad that the government is moving towards that direction, because if you look now, we don't just celebrate academic excellence alone. No, we have broadened the definitions of excellence and success to include, to consider many different types of peaks of excellence. Something that we've talked about in MOE before. Yeah?
Any comments, Terence?
Yeah, just wanted to add a point on that. As with any system of merit, those who have succeeded must also reflect on the collective sort of support that they have from the institutions, from the community, that enable them to achieve whatever success there is. So I think that's really important in understanding as well what those who have done well need to also give back to society. That will make the meritocracy, in a sense, work for Singapore.
I think the paradox of that is that the people whom have thrived and succeeded through the existing meritocratic system is probably also the ones who are least likely to want to overhaul it, right? Because like, why bite the hand that feeds you? And that really is the sort of, I guess, paradox of politics, right? And it comes into like the whole areas of like rent seeking, etc., that economists are constantly talk about. I don't see any other questions. But we still have a little bit of time on the clock. I was thinking, do you guys have any last comments?
Yeah. So,
I had a bit of
sorry, Donovan, because I see the response from Mr. Reza. I think again, I'd like to emphasize the point that the merit. I think looking at merit is important. Of course, it's not the only measure. But again, I think we need to understand and broaden the definition of merit. It's not just merit in academic excellence or merit in doing well in your exams and your high stakes assessments and whatnot. You need to look at merit and capabilities in many different areas. The fact that you have good interpersonal relations, you're able to engage with people from different backgrounds, across different demographics. So you have to look at what and understand what merit truly means. Yeah. I think sometimes we equate merit with just academic excellence and academic achievement alone or attainment alone. So we have to look beyond that. But certainly we are still a young nation. We're only 57 years old. We are still improving our policies and the way that we make our decisions for future. I think there's only one way to go, which is to do better, to do better than our predecessors, to do better than our forebears. And that comes with a lot of engagement, feedback, and perspectives that we share. There are still countries, for example, in the US, which is supposed to be the bastion of democracy and human rights, but they're still grappling with issues of racism and discrimination after hundreds of years. So I think for us, we are still making improvements. We have not yet found the ideal solutions to the way in which we want to ensure representation across the board in every sector, but we're getting there. We're working towards that.
Any other last questions? If nobody has a question, I guess maybe it had sort of like a fun question to wrap up the discussion today. So as we all know, the restrictions were finally lifted 2 days ago. I stepped out of the house today and I still see many people wearing their masks. Why do you guys think that is so? And just to add on, I heard, at least in the CBD areas, right, it is the Singaporeans who are still wearing their mask mostly, but expats not so much. Well, why do you guys think that's so?
I think Singaporeans we prefer to err on the side of caution. Wait first, even though we can take off our mask, hang on first, and take a wait and see attitude. Because for me, when I go, I still put on my mask too.
Well, I guess this comes down to self-regulation versus the sort of government-imposed baseline. Yeah, I just wanted to say, yeah, I've really been privileged to be part of the discussion tonight. I'm afraid I have to log off a little bit earlier, but I'm so glad to be able to discuss with fellow panel members and to also engage with the participants tonight. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Terence.
Thank you, Terence.
Thanks, Terence, Dr. Intan, and also Donovan for the informative dialogue. And thank you to everyone who has sent in questions. I'm sure the discussion has been very, very fervent, and we managed to cover quite a few issues tonight as well. So I trust that today's session has given all of us much food for thought and also better understanding of policy making in Singapore. So if tonight's session has intrigued you, do check out the books that our speakers have written to understand more about Singapore's politics, economy, and society. So we have Refreshing the Singapore System by Prof Terence, Social Context, Policies and Changes in Singapore, co-edited by Prof Intan, and Liberalism Unveiled by Donovan and Brian Chiang. So these are books that you can check out to also understand more about the issues that we have all discussed today that I'm sure are very dear to all our hearts, that have a big impact on our lives. So once again, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you also to our speakers for the dialogue, and have a good evening, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, sir, and thank you to all our participants and attendees. Thank you so much. Thanks, Donovan. See you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.